Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of 4 U.S. Food and Drug Administration's industry webinars to discuss the infant formula transition plan for exercise of enforcement discretion. Today's webinar will provide more in-depth information about the details outlined in the infant formula transition plan guidance and address questions. I'm Lieutenant Commander Janisha Robbs with the FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition Communications and Public Engagement staff. In a moment, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Patricia Hansen, Deputy Director of CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling, to walk through the guidance. After the presentation, we will move to the question and answer portion of the webinar, where Dr. Hansen will answer questions we received through the registration process. With that, I will now turn the call over to Dr. Patricia Hansen, Deputy Director of CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling.
Thank you, Janisha, and welcome to everybody who's tuned in today to this first webinar in our Infant Formula Transition Plan series. As Janisha mentioned, I'll be taking a deeper dive into the Infant Formula Transition Plan for Exercise of Enforcement Discretion, our guidance that published on September 30th of 2022. In today's presentation, I'm going to repeat a fair amount of information that we covered in a stakeholder call shortly after we published and posted the guidance. Some on this in the audience may be well familiar with that information, but for those who were not able to join that call or haven't had a chance to look at the materials, I want to make sure that we're all starting on a similar plane. And so first, FDA's purpose and goals in formulating this guidance. FDA is issuing this guidance document to protect public health by helping to stabilize the supply of infant formula in the U.S. and to maintain a consistent supply of a variety of infant formula products. Our goals are to ensure an adequate supply of safe and nutritionally adequate infant formula, to create a more resilient U.S. supply for infant formula products, and to help avoid the future risk of lack of access to a sole source of nutrition for a particularly vulnerable population. To help meet these goals, FDA intends to temporarily exercise enforcement discretion for certain manufacturers of infant formula that continue to introduce into interstate commerce, including through importation, but not limited to importation, infant formula products that may not comply with certain statutory and regulatory requirements if such manufacturers market these products consistent with a letter of enforcement discretion issued by FDA relating to information they, the manufacturers that is, provided in response to our May 2022 enforcement discretion guidance. And such manufacturers take specific actions to achieve compliance with the statutory and regulatory requirements applicable to their products. The guiding principles that FDA used in developing the guidance are important ground to cover, I believe. And they are as follows. Infant formula is an essential food product that is the sole source of nutrition for many infants in the U.S. And ensuring that the youngest and most vulnerable individuals in our population have access to safe and nutritionally adequate formula products is a top priority for FDA. It is also important to diversify and strengthen the U.S. infant formula supply in case of serious disruptions. Importantly, infant formula manufacturers and their manufacturing facilities must meet all regulatory requirements regarding safety, nutritional adequacy, packaging, and labeling of their products. Infant formula manufacturers and their manufacturing facilities must also meet rigorous requirements to demonstrate that each non-exempt infant formula meets the minimum requirements for quality factors, and I refer you here to the relevant section of FDA's regulations. FDA has a statutory mandate to both protect and promote the public health. Where appropriate, as in other situations, FDA may, at any time, take action, and I use the word action in the broad sense, action or steps, regarding a specific infant formula. FDA may choose to take action or certain steps if, for example, the infant formula manufacturer that is receiving enforcement discretion fails to make meaningful progress on the timeline detailed in this guidance document that we're discussing today, or we otherwise become aware of information that raises a concern about the safety or nutritional adequacy of the product. Importantly, I want to cover what is, in fact, within the scope of this guidance. So a covered infant formula manufacturer, one is within the scope of this guidance, is one to which FDA has issued a letter of enforcement discretion relating to information that they, the manufacturer, provided in response to the May 2022 guidance. The covered infant formula product is an infant formula product that is specifically identified in the letter of enforcement discretion issued to the manufacturer, again, in response to the information they provided under our May 2022 guidance. Important, what does this guidance do? What is new? The infant formula transition plan guidance provides a transparent pathway that extends the period of enforcement discretion for covered infant formula manufacturers and covered infant formula products, provided specific actions are taken. It streamlines the process to fully notified status by making use of information already provided by covered infant formula manufacturers under our May 2022 guidance. Importantly, it provides the action items that we expect manufacturers to take and the timing expectations for those action items that all relate to submitting additional information that is needed to meet regulatory requirements. This is structured in 5 different phases, which I'll be discussing in more detail as we move through the presentation. And our infant formula transition plan guidance will be in effect until October 18th of 2025. And so what does the guidance not do? What remains the same? Importantly, the guidance does not change U.S. statutory and regulatory requirements for infant formula products. All companies, including those who received enforcement discretion, all of the companies seeking to market their products long-term in the U.S. must ultimately comply with all regulatory requirements, including those related to safety, nutritional adequacy, labeling, and packaging. And infant formulas, unless exempt, also must meet the quality factor requirements in our regulations, namely sufficient biological quality of protein and normal physical growth of infants. Critically, the requirements for imported or domestically produced infant formulas are the same. I will just mention the first phase quickly, in that a covered infant formula manufacturer can request that FDA continue to exercise enforcement discretion with respect to their covered infant formula products by submitting a letter of intent to pursue completion of all regulatory requirements for one or more covered infant formula products. Now, the letter of intent can address more than one product, but please don't send us more than one letter of intent. Please put everything into the one letter of intent, which we expect you will provide to us no later than December the 5th of 2022. And FDA will respond with a letter of acknowledgement. You can see and read more about this in the guidance itself under descriptions for phase 1, and I'll be covering a little bit more detail as we go here. The infant formula transition plan guidance presents timetables or timing expectations for the 2 regulatory categories of infant formula, referred to as non-exempt and exempt, and I want to provide a little information there. The nature of the products is different, their intended use populations, and the regulatory requirements, so there are different specifics around the timelines. First, what is a non-exempt infant formula? Non-exempt infant formulas typically are intended for consumption by healthy full-term infants. And a non-exempt infant formula is an infant formula that is subject to, among other requirements, the requirements of Section 412A, B, and C of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and related FDA regulations in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Parts 106 and 107. Now, I'm going to pause here just to comment that this presentation, as the guidance itself, is loaded with references to sections of the statute, the FDA&C Act, and references to particular portions of FDA regulations. CFR is shorthand for Code of Federal Regulations. And I am not going to read out each detailed citation as we move through the presentation, or it might take us a year to get through it all. But they are provided here for ease of reference and so that folks can consult later and have the detailed specific information. So again, we've covered non-exempt. Let's move on to exempt infant formula. An exempt infant formula is an infant formula that generally is represented and labeled for use by infants who have inborn errors of metabolism or low birth weight, or who otherwise have unusual medical or dietary problems. An exempt infant formula is subject to the provisions Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 10750, very important key reference for exempt infant formula, and other FDA regulations that will be referred to throughout the presentation. First, I will cover the phases and timing expectations for non-exempt infant formulas. Here, at a glance, we presented the phases, the manufacturer's action items during each phase, and FDA's timing expectations for the manufacturer's completion of those action items. I will be addressing each phase, some details regarding the action item, and emphasizing again the timing expectations as we move through the next slides. Okay, first, phase one, the letter of intent. Covered manufacturers should submit to FDA a letter of intent identifying the specific covered infant formula products for which the firm intends to comply with all applicable regulatory requirements in accordance with this guidance. And manufacturers may include all or a subset of their covered infant formula products in their letter of intent. We would ask that manufacturers submit only one letter of intent and include all of the products for which they intend to comply with regulatory requirements in that one letter. They should send it to the by now familiar infant formula flexibility mailbox, and they should send it by December the 5th, 2022. As far as FDA's actions during phase one, FDA will review all letters of intent submitted by covered non-exempt infant formula manufacturers and communicate as needed to clarify any information. FDA will issue a letter of acknowledgement to each manufacturer that has submitted a letter of intent. If appropriate, the letter of acknowledgement will state that FDA intends to exercise enforcement discretion with respect to the specified covered infant formula products, provided that the manufacturer continues to adhere to the steps and conditions identified in our letter announcing the exercise of enforcement discretion relating to the information the manufacturer provided under the May 2022 guidance, and provided that the manufacturer continues to make meaningful progress toward compliance with all applicable regulatory requirements in accordance with the Infant Formula Transition Plan guidance. Phase two has several elements, and I'm going to cover them on these next several slides. But phase two, the deliverable, the action item from the manufacturer, is a plan for meeting regulatory requirements. The first elements in that plan, covered non-exempt infant formula manufacturers should submit a copy of product labeling conforming to the requirements in the specific sections of our regulation on the slide, or a proposed time by which that product labeling would be provided. They should also submit other information relevant to the non-exempt infant formula product which is not previously provided to FDA in the earlier request for enforcement discretion, or a proposed time by which the information would be provided. Such information might include stability testing of nutrient levels, testing of nutrient premixes, other items as listed on the slide, and gaps in information is what we're after, is filling the gaps. Importantly, another element of the plan we are asking for in Phase 2 is a demonstration of meaningful progress toward establishing that the quality factor of sufficient biological protein has been met. And for that, one of the following should be submitted: a draft protocol for an appropriate modification of a protein efficiency ratio, or PER, rat bioassay in accordance with the section stipulated in our regulations, or a draft protocol for a proposed alternative method of demonstrating that the formula supports quality factor of sufficient biological quality of protein in accordance with the particular section of our regulations cited here, or an outline of the firm's rationale for an exemption from the requirement of conducting an appropriate modification of the PER. Again, in accordance with the requirements in the specific sections of our regulations that are provided on the slide. Critical date for this plan for its submission is February the 28th, 2023. Another important element of Phase 2, that is the manufacturer's plan for meeting requirements, is to demonstrate meaningful progress toward establishing that the quality factor of normal physical growth is met. Now, as an aside, I will mention that each manufacturer should begin developing this plan for meeting the requirements for quality factor of normal physical growth really as soon as possible after submitting a statement of intent. There can be a lot to line up logistically and a fair amount to think through there, so we should begin thinking about it early. But by that critical date of February the 28th, 2023, in the plan for meeting requirements, a covered manufacturer submit either a statement of intent to conduct a growth monitoring study as detailed in our regulations, or a statement of intent to demonstrate that a formula supports normal physical growth when the formula is fed as the sole source of nutrition using an alternative method or study design that is based on sound scientific principles. Again, details are provided in the section of our regulations here, or a statement that the manufacturer otherwise intends to request an exemption from the requirements. And again, I refer you to our regulations. As part of FDA's actions related to Phase 2, FDA will review a manufacturer's draft protocol for an appropriate modification of the PER rat bioassay, draft protocol for an alternative method, or outline of the rationale for an exemption, as applicable. We intend to provide feedback to manufacturers in writing and or in a meeting. To detail further FDA's actions during Phase 2, we'll move to the next slide. So to help manufacturers prepare this information, FDA intends to meet with them to discuss the actions they should take under this guidance to ensure that covered infant formula products meet regulatory requirements, particularly those quality factor requirements, as well as when the manufacturer should take such actions. We'll also work together to identify remaining gaps in information required in the new infant formula submission that may not have been provided in full by a manufacturer in response to our May 2022 guidance, and discuss a projected schedule for the manufacturer's provision of this environment. We also intend to discuss whether the manufacturer intends to conduct a PER and a GMS consistent with the appropriate sections of our regulations to demonstrate the covered formula meets applicable quality factors, or whether the firm intends to conduct a study with an alternate method or design, or request an exemption. And I note that manufacturers may use these consultation sessions to present any other questions they might have concerning the information set forth in our guidance and the requirements for new infant formula submissions. Phase 3 for non-exempt infant formulas really focuses on the quality factors and demonstration again of meaningful progress toward establishing that they have been met. And in phase 3, we are looking as one element for a document addressing the biological quality of protein, that first quality factor. So as part of phase 3, each manufacturer of a covered non-exempt infant formula product should submit either a draft report of the appropriate modification of the PER or alternative method to the PER that it has conducted or has had conducted on its behalf, or a draft narrative explanation of why data and information demonstrate that the quality factor of sufficient biological quality of protein is met, along with the data relied on and copies of additional studies cited in support. And the critical date for phase 3 and submitting this documentation is June the 16th of 2023. Phase 3 has a second element for non-exempt infant formulas, and that is providing a plan for addressing the quality factor of normal physical growth. The manufacturer's plan should include either of the following: the design of the GMS, the growth monitoring study or clinical study it will conduct or will have conducted on its behalf, as well as a draft protocol for that study with a statistical analysis plan, or a written explanation of the firm's rationale for the requested exemption under the sections of our regulations that are shown on the slide. And we do expect a detailed narrative, a detailed written explanation of the rationale. And we are expecting this element also to be included in the documentation, the action items of phase 3, and to be supplied by June the 16th of 2023. Moving on to phase 4 for non-exempt infant formulas, the timeline starts to diverge a bit depending on the choice that the covered infant formula manufacturer has made regarding addressing normal physical growth. The deliverable of the action item for phase 4 is either the full narrative explanation for reliance on an exemption from the GMS requirements in our regulations, or the draft report documenting compliance with the GMS requirements per the regulations, or the exemption that involves use of an alternative method or study design. In either case, it is a draft report that we are looking for the study that is actually conducted to address this quality factor. If it's a narrative explanation, the timing expectation is January the 5th of 2024. If it is a draft report, the timing expectation is September the 6th of 2024. I'm not going to read through this entire slide, but it does elaborate a little bit on what we're looking for as far as the narrative explanation. If a GMS or an alternative study design is not performed. And this slide provides a bit more information on the draft report that we are expecting as a deliverable in phase 4. If a GMS is conducted or an alternative method or study design is used. And again, that date would be September the 6th of 2024. To phase 5, the final phase, and that is the submission of a new infant formula submission, providing that to FDA. And again, similar to phase 4, the timing expectations differ depending on the route that the manufacturer has chosen to address the quality factor of normal physical growth. And for a submission that requests an exemption from the GMS requirements, we expect that the new infant formula submission itself will be submitted by February the 16th of 2024. For new infant formula submissions, including a growth monitoring study per our requirements or an alternative method or study design for our requirements, we would expect that new infant formula submission to be provided by October the 18th of 2024. And this slide provides a little more detail as well as this slide. I'm not going to read these two aloud, but move on the next slide to FDA's actions related to Phase 5. And so once the new infant formula submission is provided to FDA, we will review the submission, reach out with questions as necessary, and respond to the manufacturer in accordance with our regulations. The date that FDA receives a new infant formula submission that is complete is the filing date for such submission, and we will notify the manufacturer of the filing date. For infant formulas marketed under this infant formula transition plan guidance, FDA does not intend to object to the manufacturer's continued marketing of the new non-exempt infant formula before the date that is 90 days after the date of the filing date for the submission. And that brings us to the close of the phases for non-exempt infant formulas. I'd like to move on to the phases, action items, and timing expectations for exempt infant formulas, and that is those infant formulas, specialty formulas intended for infants with low birth weight, inherited disorders of metabolism, or other special medical or dietary problems. Just a refresher. As for the non-exempt, the guidance itself provides a chart, and it's provided again here, outlining the phases, the manufacturer's action items, and FDA's timing expectations for the manufacturer's action items and provision of certain information described in the phases. As for non-exempt, the first phase is our letter of intent, phase 1. Everything is the same as for non-exempt infant formula, and so I'm not going to repeat it, but refer you instead to slides 15 and 16 of this presentation and move on. Phase 2, the manufacturer's plan for meeting regulatory requirements. While the date for this phase is the same as for non-exempt infant formula, the specifics of the action items and FDA's expectations about the details there do differ from non-exempt because the products are different and the regulatory requirements are different. And so here's where content starts to diverge in the plan for meeting regulatory requirements. So for covered exempt infant formula manufacturers, they should include in their plan and submit to FDA by February 28, 2023, the following: a copy of the product label and other labeling conforming to the relevant provisions in FDA's regulations cited here, or a proposed time by which the product labeling would be provided, unless the firm provides a rationale for deviating from the requirements. And again, that's described in other sections of our regulations. We are also looking for a statement describing how the manufacturer intends to develop the information required under these two critical sections of our regulations that are specified on the slide. And we're also looking, again, for information to fill gaps. So other information relevant to the exempt infant formula product that is needed but was not necessarily provided or provided entirely in response to the request for enforcement discretion under our May 2022 guidance. And critical date. Next, also in phase 2 in the manufacturer's plan for meeting requirements, I will note that we also, as with the non-exempt manufacturers, plan to meet to discuss the actions that should be taken, when the actions should take place, and so on to ensure that the covered exempt infant formula products will again meet regulatory requirements, to identify the remaining gaps in information that I've discussed, and also to discuss a projected schedule for the manufacturer's provision of this information. And again, manufacturers may use these consultation sessions to present any other questions they might have concerning the information set forth in the infant formula transition plan guidance and the requirements for new infant formula submissions. Next. Phase 3 for exempt infant formulas necessarily differs in detail and content from that for the non-exempt infant formulas, again, because of the nature of the products, the population for whom they are intended, and, the attendant regulatory requirements. So in phase 3, again, under a broad umbrella of additional information pertaining to covered exempt infant formula, we'll be looking in phase 3 for documentation addressing issues specifically described in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations 107.50B3 and C4. And I just provide that for emphasis and direct you to a careful read. And these are the issues needed to support that the proposed product, is appropriate for the intended population. Basically, this will be a detailed description of the medical conditions for which the infant formula is represented, detailed discussion of the dietary management of that medical condition or conditions, and the ways in which the product is intended to provide that dietary management. I will note here as a heads up that in most cases, if the manufacturer has not already done so, the manufacturer will likely need to conduct a clinical study using the infant formula product, that exempt infant formula product for which they're seeking continued enforcement discretion to support its use, again, for the intended medical condition. And the critical date for phase 3 for exempt infant formulas, and this information is August the 1st of 2023. Next. To continue with the additional information that we are looking for in phase 3 for manufacturers, they should submit the basis for any deviations from the nutrient requirements in the law or FDA's regulations. Again, the sites are here. An infant formula manufacturer may deviate from those requirements only with respect to specific requirements for which it submits to FDA the medical, nutritional, scientific, or technological rationale, including any appropriate animal or human clinical studies in support of the deviation. And this would include information on the medical rationale for the covered exempt infant formula product and the evidence for its use in the dietary management of the disorder, typically in written narrative form. And again, this information is part of phase 3. FDA's expectations for its provision is August the 1st of 2023. Next. There is additional information, again in phase 3. Again, this is a very substantive one for exempt infant formulas. Information on compliance with labeling requirements, if applicable, quality control procedure requirements. This type of information typically includes processing information, which may have been provided in response to the May 2022 guidance. Some additional information may be needed. Again, we'll look to identify that in phase 2. If applicable, we're also expecting stability information that provides the assurance that the product is not adulterated and will meet nutrient content levels up to the use-by date. Again, phase 3, August the 1st, 2023. Next, as far as FDA actions related to phase 3, importantly, FDA will review the documentation provided in phase 3 and will notify the manufacturer as to whether the information appears to provide a sufficient basis for a new infant formula submission, including whether clinical studies are required to support the use of the product for the intended medical condition. and/or we may ask for clarification or additional information. We intend to provide this feedback to manufacturers in writing and/or in a meeting. Next. Phase 4 marks kind of a divergence in the action item, the expectation, the deliverable that we are looking for in phase 4, and that's data related to exempt status and clinical evidence. If a manufacturer will be proceeding in a case where clinical studies are not required, we'll be looking for this documentation by January the 5th of 2024. If a clinical study or studies are going to be required, we will be looking for this data and evidence by June the 6th of 2025. Moving on to the next slide, a little bit more detail. Not a lot of extra detail here where clinical studies are not required, but we're going to need the full documentation as specified under our regulations to support the use of the product for the intended medical condition. And again, this is to demonstrate meaningful progress. As far as timing expectations, this should be submitted by January the 5th, 2024. If clinical studies are required, we are looking for the data related to exempt status and the clinical evidence by June the 6th of 2025. And what we are looking for in terms of the deliverable would be draft study reports and, if applicable, published literature relevant to the medical condition for which the product is represented for use and the dietary management of such medical condition. You know, I will note, and others have noted, I'm sure, the later date here. We've allowed more time here in the case where studies will need to be conducted, studies, because they will be conducted in populations with likely limited number of infants. The population of infants, you know, in the general population, the subpopulation with inborn errors of metabolism is not large. And so we factored in additional time to conduct studies since the subject recruitment may be more challenging. And now we come to the final phase, phase 5, which is the new infant formula submission. Again, a divergence in dates depending on whether clinical studies are or are not required. FDA's expectation for the new infant formula submission where clinical studies are not required is February 16th of 2024. If studies are required, a new infant formula submission in that case is expected by July 18th of 2025. Next. And this is basically the same information spelled out a little bit more in full text, same content, same dates as on the previous slide. FDA's actions relevant to phase 5 are here. Once the new infant formula submission is received, we will review it, reach out with questions if necessary, and respond to the manufacturer upon completion of our review. And for additional information, I direct you to this particular portion of FDA's regulations shown on the slide. And while FDA conducts its reviews of new infant formula submissions for covered exempt infant formulas, FDA does not intend to object to the manufacturer's continued marketing of such covered exempt infant formula. And that brings us to the end of the overview of the new infant formula transition plan guidance. The next several slides are resources that you may find helpful, links to the transition plan guidance, that email box address again, routes where other questions can be submitted, several different guidance documents that stakeholders might find useful, and 2 more postings up on our website with some questions and answers concerning infant formula, and then a very comprehensive listing of the guidance documents and regulatory information relevant to infant formula that are available in a whole series of links. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. At this time, we will begin the question and answer portion of the call and answer several of the questions we received during the webinar registration process. As we cannot get to all the questions that were submitted, we will definitely answer the most frequently asked questions along with any clarifying questions. Our first question is, can FDA explain why this new guidance was not issued as a proposed rule for public comment prior to implementation, given its sweeping and long-term impacts?
We have issued guidance rather than a proposed rule because we are not establishing or proposing to establish new requirements for infant formula. Rather, we are describing conditions under which we intend to continue to exercise enforcement discretion with respect to some of our regulatory requirements for covered infant formula manufacturers and covered infant formula products, provided certain actions are taken by those covered infant formula manufacturers. And I will note that as with any FDA guidance, the public may comment on the guidance at any time.
We received a few questions about what's happening and what's going on with the current enforcement discretion request. One question we received is, what if an enforcement discretion request is in the request system but is still under review? What happens to such a request? And will FDA ever answer this request?
Well, FDA is still reviewing requests that have been submitted in response to the May 2022 guidance, and FDA plans to respond to all requests that have been received by November the 14th, 2022. Some of those responses may be letters of enforcement discretion, others will not, but FDA will respond.
Since there are a number of manufacturers still awaiting a response from FDA on their enforcement discretion application, is the FDA considering extending the May 2022 enforcement discretion guidance November 14th deadline to allow for the continued review of these applications?
No, FDA is not considering extending the November 14th expiration date for the May 2022 guidance. However, as I just mentioned, we are continuing to review requests that are submitted to us before that expiration date.
Great. And here are two questions. Can additional firms still submit requests for enforcement discretion under the May 2022 guidance until November 14th, or are new requests no longer being accepted and reviewed? And related, will more manufacturers obtain letters of enforcement discretion, or is this route closed to new and or current still in the system requests?
Okay, these are great questions and give me an opportunity to address a few points. So the May 2022 enforcement discretion policy guidance will expire, as I mentioned, on November the 14th of 2022. As I also mentioned, FDA is still reviewing requests in the queue and is also still accepting requests for review. However, November 14th is fast approaching. As many of you are aware, the review of any request takes time, and we typically have questions that require some exchange or back and forth with the requesters, and which can increase that time. Consequently, if a firm is interested in having a new request considered, we would need a complete request very soon. Also, given the upcoming expiration date of the May 2022 guidance, our very limited staffing, and the number of requests in the queue, we are not able to provide individual status updates or projected review timeframes for those requests. We will reach out if we have questions. And last but not least, I will note that FDA is currently prioritizing the review of specialty formulas. That is, certain exempt formulas for infants with special medical needs, because many of those formulas are in shorter supply compared to the general or non-exempt infant formulas.
In relation to the infant formula manufacturers requesting that FDA continue to exercise enforcement discretion by December 5th, 2022, what happens with those companies which have already submitted their request of enforcement discretion, but they have not yet received an answer from FDA? Should they submit a letter of intent before December 5th, 2022? And for example, there is a manufacturer who submitted an application in July, and they have been advised it is still under active review, but they have not received a response from FDA regarding the application. What does all of this mean for that company? Are they still under active review? Are they allowed to start selling product into the United States if they commit to the pathways forward for FDA compliance?
Thanks, Janisha. That's a lot of information here, too. As I've mentioned, we are still reviewing requests in the queue, and will continue to review requests that are submitted by November the 14th. But I also want to be very direct here on one point in particular. If you do not receive a letter of enforcement discretion from FDA relating to information you have provided in an enforcement discretion request, responding to our May 2022 guidance. So if you do not have a letter of enforcement discretion issued by us in accordance with that guidance, do not start selling, distributing, or importing your infant formula products in the U.S. If you have not received such a letter from us, do not send us a letter of intent. And again, do not start selling, distributing, or importing your infant formula products into the U.S. Only covered infant formula manufacturers, as described in the guidance and as I've described here in this presentation, and covered infant formula products, again, as described in the September 2022 transition plan guidance and in this presentation, are eligible for the pathway described in the guidance. Those who are not covered infant formula manufacturers or covered infant formula products who wish to enter the U.S. market longer term are welcome, however, to submit a new infant formula submission through the normal established process.
Thank you. Two more questions, and two questions that are related to each other. First one, will FDA support new domestic manufacturers to go through the same process? And given that there is a new pathway for non-U.S. infant formulas to gain entry to the U.S. market, will there be updates to existing pathway for new or updated infant formulas to gain entry to the U.S. market?
These are good questions that give me an opportunity to clarify a couple of things. First, the pathway described in the September 2022 infant formula transition plan guidance is not limited to non-U.S. firms and facilities. A covered U.S. manufacturer with covered infant formula products would be eligible to pursue the pathway described in that guidance. Also, as I've mentioned, the September 2022 guidance does not establish new regulatory requirements for infant formula products. The regulatory requirements remain the same, and they are the same for both U.S. and foreign firms and facilities and the products manufactured by and in those firms and facilities.
Will manufacturing facilities of enforcement discretion formulas be subject to the same annual inspection that current domestic facilities receive during the transition period?
All facilities manufacturing infant formula products in interstate commerce or being introduced into interstate commerce in the U.S. are subject to FDA inspection. All facilities. FDA typically inspects such facilities on an annual basis.
Will all of our submission materials go through the email box, or should we set up an IF-TRAC account?
Currently, I have to say the electronic track system, FDA system for new infant formula submissions, is not configured to handle the process outlined in the infant formula transition plan guidance. Consequently, at this time, those milestones and deliverables identified in phases 1 through 4 as applicable should be sent to us via the email address that I provided on slide 15 and again on slide 46. That would be that infant formula flexibility mailbox.
How do manufacturers address potential changes during the transition period? For example, if a manufacturer needs to change a packaging component or an ingredient due to supply chain issues, would an amendment to the notification still be appropriate during transition period?
Okay. The answer to this question will really depend on the specifics involved. And I would advise covered infant formula manufacturers to raise this and to discuss these types of questions and specifics with FDA in the individual consultation sessions described in our September 2022 guidance and earlier in this presentation. That's exactly the sort of thing that we want to tackle in a meeting and gain clarity on.
Great, thank you. And moving on to our last question for today. We received a number of questions regarding the different ways to meet the quality factor requirements and data information needed. Can you provide more detail and clarity around these?
Sure, and I'm just taking a look again at some of these questions, and these are really all very good questions. Different questions on the quality factor or biological quality of protein, another couple on establishing that normal physical growth, that quality factor has been met, and the different alternatives that I've covered very briefly in a high-level overview in this presentation. I will say we will be providing more information about our quality factor requirements, including the typical studies used to establish that these have been met. So that's the PER, the protein efficiency ratio rat bioassay, and the growth monitoring study. I really encourage everyone to tune in to webinar number 2 in this series, where our regulatory requirements and recommendations for new infant formula submissions will be discussed. And then also to webinars numbers 3 and 4, where the quality factors of sufficient biological quality of protein and normal physical growth will be discussed respectively.
Great, thank you, Dr. Hansen. As a reminder, the next webinar in the series will be held on November 4th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will focus on the new infant formula submission requirements. If you haven't already, please register to attend the webinar series. For your convenience, the registration link in the webinar series is located in the YouTube description box below. One registration provides access to all webinars. This concludes today's webinar. A recording will be available on the FDA's meeting webpage shortly. Thank you and goodbye.